So I have never enjoyed being a PK until maybe recently. And by recently, I mean the past 2 years. I hated being a pastor's kid growing up. I hated it because we moved around quite frequently during my early childhood years. I hated it because I felt an extra burden to be a good church girl. I remember my mom telling me not to wear that dark lipstick to church. That dark red brick lipstick that was so popular. I remember my mom saying not to wear that. I hated it when church members commented on my clothing. I hated having my dad be a workaholic. He's a workaholic. He's great at what he does because he's a workaholic. Growing up as a child and teenager and having a limited understanding of what ministry is, I only saw what happens behind closed doors. And so a lot of it is the heartache and the hardship of immigrant ministry. There are parts of me that hated the church, but at the same time, it's where it's a place that nurtured me, especially when I was a teenager and especially when I moved to Richmond, Virginia. Virginia is an interesting place where it's 99% white almost. It feels very white, and it's a southern area. It's a capital of the South, the Confederate South, and you can't claim to say you are from Virginia or from Richmond unless you have, say, 5 generations from there. And so there's a very clear line between being a white Virginian and a non-white. And then Asians are few and far in between. In fact, in high school, I remember being one of the only maybe 2 or 3 Asians. And the other Asian students weren't second generation like myself. They were from mainland Asia. And those were not the students you wanted to hang out with. And so I was always seen as the outsider. But at church, I was an insider. And so my name, I don't have to describe my name or pronounce it. We can complain about our parents and we all get it. There was just a sense of being able to relax and being at home and really feeling like the insider. So my sense of self-worth and identity was really nurtured at the church. I was really lucky and had excellent youth pastors. And I was super involved in youth group ministry and took leadership roles there. Had I not had that on the side, teenage years would have been that much more angst-ridden and heavy. But that's all to say I still hated being a PK growing up. My number one prayer as a teenager was, God, I promise I will volunteer as a Sunday school teacher when I'm an adult, but I will not be employed by the church. I said I'm never ever going to be employed by the church. And that's a funny thing, not saying never ever, because life just has a funny way of throwing things at you and working out in ways that you may not have predicted. So fast forward now, and I am in ministry, and I'm a candidate in the Presbyterian Church USA, and I'm ready to receive a call soon to be an associate pastor somewhere. And I can't believe it, but I started the process back in 2002. That's almost 15 years. And finally now I'm excited and happy about it. I have a sense of pride in the way I have been raised, and the kicking and screaming, and everything I've learned from my parents as well as the Korean immigrant church, with all the baggage and the burden and the ugliness, as well as the really rich heritage that I've received from it. So I grew up being mostly involved in youth ministry, and I love that. That's the demographic that has, that they have my heart. My heart just beats to the rhythm of their highs and lows. I love that group. But more recently, I've also grown really frustrated and also drawn to the millennials. And so the 18 to about 33, 34, depending on which statistic you're going with. But that age group where the demographic that is growing the most is the spiritual but not religious, right? The nuns, the NONES. And I think one of the reasons why I'm also drawn to that group is because some of my closest friends reflect the belief systems and the attitudes of these spiritual but not religious people. And so when you're asking me about my vision maybe in 5 to 10 years in ministry, I want to be a kick-ass pastor for that demographic. I think the biggest challenge for millennials is having a yearning, a sincere, deep yearning to experience and express spirituality on one hand, and wanting to explore that authentically. And then on the other hand, not having a community or a place to do it. You can do spirituality on your own. You can be a spiritual person. You can practice spirituality on your own, and that's wonderful. But there's a sense of accountability, a beautiful accountability that comes with being part of a community that will support and nurture that sense of spirituality. And I think millennials have struggle. One of their biggest challenges is being able to find a place where their spirituality can be explored in ways that are not tied to an institutional church. And the reason why I say institutional church is because there's so much baggage with the institutional church, right? Whether it's the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church. And there's just a lot of disdain for it. There's a lot of hypocrisy around it. What we see in the headlines are never puts church in a good light. And so it makes sense. It makes total sense for my friends who are non-churchgoers but very spiritual, why they wouldn't want to go to church. And I want to be part of that pioneering generation that shifts that. That's part of that shift, where they can find a community where they can explore and express their spirituality. I think churches like Hillsong and perhaps more evangelical churches are growing because one is their focus on small groups, and small groups are focusing on building community and relationships, right? And I think that's what every human being's looking for and longing for, to connect with someone else, to connect in a community. Another reason that I think those evangelical churches are growing, and they are, even the Pew Forum attests the fact that they are growing and not declining in membership, is I think they're really excellent at Bible study. I think that's an area that mainline denominations really need to focus on. Just having Bible study, good old-fashioned Bible study, rather than just the glitz and glamour of having exciting programs or fellowship only. You have to balance that out with like, okay, let's study this really difficult text. Let's figure out these Old Testament scripture passages that make God look really angry and violent. How do we interpret that? All right, I believe in gay ordination and so forth. Well, then what about the texts that say otherwise? How do I interpret it? Like, what are my tools for interpretation? I think what has happened with mainline denominations and churches that are more perhaps progressive or liberal is we don't want to look at the ugly parts of the text. Oh. We're going to be the church that volunteers. We're going to be the church that has a great soup kitchen. Right. We're going to do that. We're going to love neighbor with our actions. But you know what? We're not going to really study the Bible together and figure out how to interpret this differently, or interpret this and be really uncomfortable with what the text is saying. But we won't get into the nitty-gritty of Scripture, and we won't talk about Jesus Christ. Evangelicals talk about Jesus Christ. They look at Scripture, right. And people are attracted to that, as they should be. And I think that's something that we as in progressive mainline denominations and churches really need to do a better job with. My name is Aram Bae, and this is my Korean American story.